The bus screeched to a halt at the stop, its doors groaning as they swung open. Jamal stepped inside, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The long shift at the warehouse had drained him, and every muscle in his body ached for rest. He adjusted his backpack, scanning the crowded space for an open seat. The bus was packed, filled with the usual mix of passengers, students glued to their phones, office workers lost in thought, and weary souls just trying to get home. As he shuffled down the aisle, he spotted an open seat near the middle of the bus. A sigh of relief almost escaped his lips as he lowered himself onto the worn-out cushion. Finally, a moment to breathe, he leaned back, feeling the vibrations of the moving vehicle beneath him, letting his eyes drift shut for just a second. The murmur of conversation, the soft hum of the engine, and the occasional honk of traffic outside blurred into the background. His mind wandered to the day's events, the endless boxes he had lifted, the sweat on his brow, the quiet moments where he dreamed of something better. Life hadn't been easy, but he kept pushing forward. Then, a slight disturbance in the rhythm of the bus caught his attention. The shuffle of tired feet, the sound of someone gripping the metal pole a little too tightly. He opened his eyes and noticed an elderly woman standing just a few steps away. Her frail hands trembled as she clutched the overhead railing, her knuckles turning white from the strain. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back, and she wore a simple, faded blue coat that had seen better days. Jamal felt a pang of guilt settle in his chest. She shouldn't be standing, not at her age. He glanced around, hoping someone else would notice, hoping that maybe someone closer would offer their seat. But the passengers around her remained oblivious, lost in their own worlds, staring at their screens or gazing out the windows. His legs protested as he shifted to stand, but he ignored the ache. With a small, tired smile, he gestured toward his seat. "Ma'am, please, have my seat," he said, his voice kind but firm. The woman's eyes widened slightly in surprise, as if she wasn't used to such gestures anymore. A soft smile crept across her lips, and for a moment, it seemed like she wanted to refuse. But the weariness in her bones won over pride, and she slowly nodded. "Bless you, young man," she whispered as she carefully eased herself down. Jamal stepped back, gripping a nearby pole to steady himself as the bus jerked forward. His feet planted firmly on the floor, and he shifted his weight, trying to find some comfort in his new position. It wasn't much, but it was the right thing to do. He didn't think much of it after that. Just a small act of kindness. Nothing special. The bus rolled on, the city lights flickering through the window as the streets blurred past. He let his thoughts drift again, already imagining the relief of finally getting home, peeling off his work clothes, and collapsing onto his bed. But then, just as the bus slowed at the next stop, he felt a light tap on his arm. The elderly woman was looking at him, her expression unreadable, yet there was something deep in her gaze, something almost knowing. Before he could react, she reached into the pocket of her coat, pulled out a small folded piece of paper, and pressed it gently into his hand. Confused, he looked down at the note resting in his palm. The paper was slightly crumpled, its edges worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times before. He glanced up at her, but she simply gave him a small nod, as if encouraging him to take it. Then, as the bus doors opened, she stood, stepping off into the night without another word. Jamal watched her go, feeling an odd mixture of curiosity and unease settle in his stomach. What was this? Why had she given it to him? His fingers tightened around the note, the warmth of her touch still lingering on the paper. Whatever was written inside, he had no idea that it was about to change his life forever. Jamal stood there for a moment, watching the elderly woman disappear into the night. The bus doors hissed shut behind her, and the vehicle jolted forward again, resuming its journey through the dimly lit streets. He looked down at the small, crumpled piece of paper in his hand, feeling its delicate texture between his fingers. The note was old, its edges slightly frayed, as if it had been handled many times before. His mind raced with questions. Why had she given this to him? What could possibly be inside? He hesitated before unfolding it, glancing around at the other passengers. Nobody seemed to have noticed the exchange. The teenagers in the back were still glued to their phones, an older man near the front was staring blankly out the window, and a woman with a baby was gently rocking her child to sleep. It was as if the moment had passed unnoticed, a quiet, mysterious interaction between him and the woman, hidden in plain sight. With a deep breath, he carefully unfolded the paper, smoothing out its creases with his thumb. His eyes scanned the handwritten message, the words scribbled in shaky, uneven letters. Go to 145 West Elm Street at 6 p.m. tonight. Trust me. Jamal read the note twice, then a third time, as if expecting the words to change before his eyes. His heart thumped in his chest, a strange mixture of curiosity and unease washing over him. Who was this woman? Why had she chosen him? And why such a cryptic message? For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was some kind of mistake. But the way she had looked at him, the quiet intensity in her eyes, told him that this wasn't random. She had meant for him to receive this. He stuffed the note into his pocket, his mind spiraling with possibilities. Was it a trap, some kind of setup? He had heard stories before, strangers luring people into dangerous situations under mysterious pretenses. But something about the old woman's demeanor didn't feel threatening. If anything, she had seemed kind, almost grateful. The bus continued its route, the streetlights flickering through the windows as they passed blocks of apartment buildings, stores, and restaurants. Jamal barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the note, his fingers brushing against it absent-mindedly inside his pocket. By the time his stop arrived, he was no closer to a decision. As he stepped off the bus and onto the cold pavement, he glanced at his watch. 5:12 p.m., less than an hour until 6. His apartment was only a few blocks away, but instead of heading straight home, he found himself walking in the opposite direction, drawn by an inexplicable pull toward the unknown address. He told himself he would just check it out from a distance, see if the place even existed. If it looked suspicious, he'd turn around and go home. As he walked, the city buzzed around him, cars honking, pedestrians rushing by, street vendors calling out their final sales before the night took over. But Jamal barely noticed any of it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the brief interaction on the bus over and over again. He had done a simple, decent thing, giving up his seat. That was all, but somehow, it had led to this. By the time he reached West Elm Street, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He slowed his pace, scanning the numbers on the buildings. 139, 141, 143, and then, finally, 145. His breath caught slightly as he took in the sight before him. It wasn't what he had expected. The building was old but elegant, a grand mansion tucked between more modern structures. Its exterior was slightly worn, but it still held an air of dignity, as if it had stood through decades of history, untouched by time. A tall iron gate surrounded the property, and beyond it, a path lined with overgrown bushes led to a heavy wooden door. A single lantern flickered beside the entrance, casting a soft, golden glow. Jamal checked his watch, 5:57 p.m. His fingers curled around the note in his pocket, feeling its presence like a weight pressing against him. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the gate, his heart pounding louder with each step. He reached out, hesitating for just a moment, before finally pushing it open. The hinges creaked softly, as if whispering a warning. Jamal stepped inside. Jamal's footsteps echoed on the stone pathway as he moved toward the grand house. The dim glow of the lantern near the door cast flickering shadows across the overgrown bushes, making them seem almost alive. His heart pounded against his ribs, every beat loud in the quiet night air. He had no idea what he was walking into, but something deep inside him urged him forward. He had come too far to turn back now. As he reached the heavy wooden door, he hesitated for a moment, staring at the brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. He swallowed hard and raised his hand, gripping the cold metal before rapping it against the door. The sound was deep and hollow, echoing into the silence. He took a step back, his breath shallow as he waited. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Just as he began to wonder if he had made a mistake, the door creaked open. A tall man, probably in his 50s, stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. His sharp eyes studied Jamal for a moment before a small, knowing smile crossed his face. "You must be Jamal," the man said, his voice calm yet firm. Jamal blinked in surprise. Yeah, I got this note from a lady on the bus earlier today. She told me to come here." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small piece of paper as if to prove his words. The man's gaze flickered to the note, and he gave a short nod. "Yes, my mother." Jamal's breath caught. "Your mother." His mind raced. The elderly woman, this was her son. "Come in," the man said, stepping aside. Jamal hesitated only for a second before stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly floral, like an old perfume still lingering in the air. The walls were lined with framed photographs, their edges slightly worn, as if they had been cherished for decades. Some of the images were black and white, others faded with time, but they all featured the same woman, the elderly lady from the bus. In one picture, she stood beside a man in a military uniform, his arm wrapped protectively around her. In another, she was much younger, holding a small boy's hand, perhaps the man standing before him now. Jamal's eyes roamed the room, his mind struggling to piece everything together. Why had she sent him here? The man gestured toward a chair in the grand living room. Please, have a seat. Jamal slowly lowered himself onto the plush armchair, his muscles still tense. The man sat across from him, resting his hands on his knees. My name is Charles Whitmore, he said. My mother, Eleanor, told me about you today. Jamal frowned. But, why? I just gave her my seat. It was nothing. Charles's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. To you, it may have been nothing. But to her, it was everything. He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. My mother was a firm believer that kindness reveals a person's true character. She spent much of her life looking for people who embodied that belief, who showed kindness not because they wanted recognition, but because it was simply who they were. Jamal shifted in his seat, unsure of where this was going. I don't understand. Charles stood and walked toward a nearby desk, opening a drawer. He pulled out an envelope and returned to his seat, handing it to Jamal. This is for you. Jamal hesitated before taking the envelope, its weight heavier than he expected. He carefully tore it open, pulling out a letter. The handwriting was familiar, the same shaky script from the note on the bus. Jamal, if you are reading this, then I have already left this world. But I want you to know that today, you gave me something I have not felt in a long time, hope. In a world where people are often too busy to notice one another, you saw me. You cared, and for that, I am eternally grateful. Jamal's throat tightened as he continued reading. I have spent my life building something, not for myself, but for someone who would one day prove worthy of carrying it forward. That person, I believe, is you. Enclosed in this letter, you will find the deed to this house, as well as access to a trust fund that will allow you to pursue your dreams, whatever they may be. Jamal's hands trembled as he flipped to the next page, where legal documents confirmed everything. His eyes darted back up to Charles, his mind struggling to process what he had just read. I don't understand. Why would she leave this to me? She didn't even know me. Charles exhaled, leaning back slightly. That's where you're wrong. My mother had been searching for a long time, searching for someone who understood the value of kindness without expecting anything in return. She watched people, observed their actions, and when she found someone who truly embodied that spirit, she made sure they were rewarded in ways they never could have imagined. Jamal's heart pounded. This had to be some kind of mistake. He was just a regular guy, working a job to make ends meet. He didn't deserve this. I can't accept this, he said, shaking his head. This is too much. Charles smiled softly. That's exactly why she chose you. Jamal sat there, his mind racing, his emotions tangled in a whirlwind of disbelief, gratitude, and overwhelming awe. He had stepped onto that bus expecting nothing more than a ride home. Instead, he had stepped into a destiny he never saw coming. He looked down at the letter again, reading the final words Eleanor had written to him. Jamal, never stop being the person you are. The world needs more souls like yours. And now, you have the power to change even more lives, just as you changed mine. A lump formed in his throat, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt something he hadn't before, something deeper than gratitude.